As I read both of the joint statements, I was struck by how much was the same and how little was different. The most recent joint statement certainly reflected some of the recent events that have been of great concern, the North Korean rhetoric and ramping up of the provocative language, some other items that I think were in there that were new. But by and large, it was a very consistent document from 2009. And I say that with great, I think that was a very good signal, because it shows how the important dimensions of the alliance that are starting to happen have been consistent over this last period, and show that what has been the goals in the 2009 Joint Vision Statement are still important and are still being carried over. And I think show that those are some very important trends in that declaration. And in particular, I think the theme of a comprehensive strategic alliance, again, was very clear, very solid throughout. That the alliance, while still being very clearly, very strongly focused on the central concern of North Korea, it is also looking much more broadly at regional issues and beyond that to global issues. Because I think increasingly the importance of the U.S.-South Korean alliance is not just for events on the peninsula, it is also to address global issues. Because the United States and South Korea, I think increasingly again are seeing that there are important common interests that go beyond the peninsula, and that they can work together for many of those issues, like environmental issues, anti-piracy issues, terrorism issues, all sorts of different things that are common global issues, and that's an important dimension of the joint statements that I think was a very clear element of consistency throughout that particular statement. I think as well it is an important statement to show how the overall alliance is evolving from one that in the past was, as it was often described, a patron-client relationship where South Korea was the little brother, the United States was the big brother, and it is much more now a partnership between the two countries. And a relationship that carries all, that goes along with that notion of being a partnership, in that the United States and South Korea has a much more mature relationship. But it also means that now there has to be much greater attention to shared interests and shared relations. As far as improvements in the overall relationship go, I mean, when you look at from 2009 to 2013, gosh, a lot has happened between those years. And in particular, 2010 is a key piece to what happened with the sinking of the Chonan and the shelling of Yeonpyeong-do. I think that if I would answer that question, I think there are two key pieces that to me show some very important improvements in and changes and advancements in the alliance. I think coming out of a good deal of what happened in 2010, you have much greater security cooperation, even though it was already at a very high level. I think you have some increased focus on some important issues in the alliance. In particular, the Extended Deterrence Policy Commission that came out of not so much the Chonan and such, but the nuclear tests and other things, that there's much greater collaboration and discussion about extended deterrence, nuclear umbrella sorts of issues. That for many years, these were issues that the United States and South Korea didn't always talk that much about. Many things were assumed and such. But now I think very, very helpful that the United States and South Korea is having increased dialogue about those issues. The other key piece that I think does very much come out of the events of 2010 was the increased collaboration of how we might respond together to North Korean provocations, the sort of counter-provocation policy coordination. Again, I think that in the past there was very much a sort of ad hoc dimension to how we might respond to things that North Korea would do. And now I think we have had much greater discussions about how we might together view these issues and respond together. And most importantly, hopefully, that sense of cooperation and collaboration will help deter the North Koreans from even trying to do these things any more than they already have in the past. Because, again, I think that the more that the United States and South Korea can talk about these issues, communication is a very central part of the alliance. And we will never know exactly what the next provocative action might be. And so there will always be some degree of, okay, we have to sit down and sort of talk and figure out because it's different this time. But to have that basis of cooperation and communication, I think, can be a very, very helpful thing to be able to move forward. The other key thing that I think has been a very important element of the alliance moving forward has been the conclusion of the Free Trade Agreement. That has just passed its one-year anniversary as well. And while I know that there is still some anxiety in South Korea and in the United States about free trade agreements, perhaps in general, I think so far the economists have pointed to the success of this agreement in the short term. And another sign of how the alliance is much more than a military alliance, that it is a broader partnership among a lot of different issues, and economics, again, as signified by the Free Trade Agreement, is an important step forward along those lines. To your broader question about what do I see as the challenges for the future of the alliance, I would preface this by saying, again, this is the 60th anniversary of the alliance. It is a long relationship. Any relationship that lasts that long is going to have disagreements, and there are going to be times when there are friction points between us, times that we agree and disagree, and times when the alliance is not going very well. Certainly, though, the last 5 years or so, the alliance has been going very well, and it has been perhaps some of the best times of the U.S.-South Korean alliance, and I think that is a great testimony to the leadership. And many people were watching, particularly this summit, to see, with a new South Korean president, would it carry over into a second Obama administration? And it seems so far that the signs are good that it will be a continuation of a very good, positive relationship. But that still doesn't mean that there are as within any family as well, difficulties that you may still have to deal with and talk about. And I think there are a few that at least I think will likely be the usual suspects, if you will, that will continue to be irritants again, perhaps in any relationship. And let me first start by saying that I think one of the biggest challenges is going to be North Korea policy. Not that I think it's a problem, and that I think, again, we have had great coordination on North Korea policy over the last number of years. But that challenge is going to continue to evolve. And while, again, I don't think it's a challenge in a negative sense of what we have done, I think it will continue to be a challenge to make sure the coordination that has been good up to this point will continue. That what we do with North Korea is just a challenge in its own right, and as well a challenge for, for coordination. Now, I think you did see in the summit agreement, in the statement, as well as during the joint press conference, a good deal of indication that the United States is very much, together with South Korea on the current policy towards North Korea, and is supportive of President Park's determination to reach out to North Korea in her trust-building process. But of course, with that said, the deterrence remains strong, and she will not put up with any North Korean provocations. Still, to her credit, being willing to reach out and try to engage North Korea, that the Obama administration is supportive of that. I think, frankly, they are very happy and supportive to let South Korea take the lead on this issue. I think from a domestic politics standpoint for the United States, President Obama is very busy these days with a lot of other issues, some good, some not so good. And so I think he is very happy to let South Korea take the lead on this, and there's not a lot of domestic political benefit that he would get by reaching out at this point to North Korea. but I think is very supportive of the South Korean administration doing that. And so I think we will see some good good coordination again. But again, to come back to sort of that final point on this, that it will continue to be a challenge to maintain that coordination, not because of any lack of effort by the United States and South Korea, but because of the growing difficulties of a North Korean challenge. I think the nuclear cooperation issue will also be a challenge, as that will be a very difficult negotiating position, as you're well aware of what the positions are on both sides, as South Korea would like to see the United States give in on its previous insistence that that South Korea stop with the reprocessing part of the nuclear fuel cycle. I don't know how that's going to turn out. I will leave that to the negotiators to decide. But I think it will be something that, again, given that the alliance is in very good shape in all other dimensions, I think that will be something that will be worked out in a reasonable way by both sides. But again, that remains one of those issues that could be a problem, one of those friction points that is there even when alliances and such are good. Budgets and burden sharing are always an issue when it comes to an alliance. Both sides want the other side to pay more. And we have had progress with the special measures agreement to try to have that be on a longer cycle, so we're not doing that so frequently. But every time we begin to look at budgets, that's always a difficult issue. And again, how that is resolved, I'm not certain. I won't try to predict that. But again, it is an issue that I think both sides will continue to sit down and talk about the different burden sharing parts of this and put this in the context of the larger overall alliance, and hopefully we'll be able to come to some reasonable accommodation on these issues. Lastly, long term in regards to the alliance, I think one of the challenges could be differing perceptions about China and how China is viewed by the different administrations. And this could possibly be an issue long past the Obama and the Pak administrations. But I think you are starting to see that being an issue already, at least in the point that you have heard President Pak talk about a balanced relationship with China. You know, that's a subtle way of talking about how China is a very important economic player for South Korea. But from the United States perspective, I think the U.S. still is debating within the United States about the degree to which China is a concern, a security concern down the road. But if that becomes more serious to the United States, South Korea could get pulled in two different directions. And I think that could be a challenge that both sides will have to look at and discuss. I don't think that's necessarily an issue that becomes a wedge that breaks the alliance, but I think it could long-term be something that is a challenge that both sides will need to continue to think about and talk about and work on. I think there could be some very hard negotiations in regards to the nuclear cooperation agreement. And that could potentially be an issue of friction between the alliance. But I'm not certain it's going to be one that can't be solved in one way or another, and that there aren't some possible ways to address that. I think, as you say, the strategic patience piece, the Obama administration, I think, has, there was a sense in Washington, I think, that strategic patience was starting to not necessarily be productive about a year ago. And so some belief that perhaps we need to reach out to North Korea and see if we could not perhaps engage them in some way. And you had the Leap Day agreement and a sense that perhaps some progress had been made in that. And then, of course, the declaration a month later that we're going to launch a satellite. And I think the Obama administration clearly felt they were burned on that issue and really have no interest in trying that. I think that there is very little politically that, even if they wanted to, that they could offer as incentives to North Korea, because there is just not much will in the U.S. Congress, certainly, if anything requires money. But even just sort of in the broader political context, there's not much ability for the president to do much at this point to offer any sort of incentives to North Korea. And so I think it is very difficult. And so that is why I believe that the Obama administration is happy to let President Park take the lead on perhaps trying to engage. I think perhaps as well that may even be the most appropriate, that the first place to start is inter-Korean relations as the area that needs to improve. But clearly President Park has tried now, what, 3 times I think she has offered to engage, and the North Koreans have said no each time. And so perhaps we are not going to, there won't be much trust building for at least the time being. And I don't know what the answer is to that. You know, I think sometimes in discussions, folks look at these various policies and decide, well, we're not doing enough, and there are things that need to be done to change, and we can fix this policy. I'm not so sure there is an obvious policy solution here that's going to fix this immediately or soon. We keep trying to try different various dimensions, and it's just a very difficult and tractable problem that we need to be prepared for the long term to be dealing with. But again, I certainly in my comments did not mean to imply that I think these challenges are going to be easy and are small. They could potentially be some very difficult issues. But again, I think that the alliance is solid on so many other areas that helps build a good framework, I think, for being able to address some of these issues in the future. I think my recommendations are a bit general, because I think in some respects it's hard to tell what the challenges of the alliance will be in specific recommendations. But let me say that I think very, very importantly that continuing the close dialogue and communication between the alliance is very important. I think if you look historically at the times when the alliance was not doing well, those were times when we weren't always talking as often and as closely as we needed to be. And so I think, again, as future challenges come up, in particular over North Korean issues, that we continue to dialogue, particularly over how we will respond to North Korea, what our common shared vision is about how we deal with North Korean actions and the future of a North Korean nuclear program. I think those are going to be important issues. I think we need to have a continued focus on looking at what our common interests are. There are many who study alliance behavior and look at why alliances continue. And you look at the U.S.-South Korean alliance, and 60 years is a long time for an alliance to last. Now, clearly we have a common interest in defending South Korea against North Korea, and that original rationale for the alliance remains. But you are increasingly seeing that set of interests being broader, and that shared set of common interests fueling, I think, what is going to drive the relationship on into the future. And even imagine at some point when reunification might happen. Will the alliance go away? I think some of these common interests will continue to facilitate continued cooperation between the United States and South Korea. And I think there are a couple that are important and important interests that I think really speak to how South Korea has become an important player as a mid-level power that has shown why it is an important partner for the United States. One, I think South Korea's contributions to the anti-piracy missions in or off the coast of Somalia is an important indicator of how South Korea, and having its capability, has shown that it contributes to international security cooperation. South Korea has a lot of important economic interests in the free flow of commerce, and its ability to contribute to that is very important. I think another key piece is how South Korea has become a donor of foreign assistance. That, as I understand it, the only country in the world that was a recipient of foreign assistance that is now a donor of foreign assistance. And that shows how South Korea is not only an important player and again, using its wealth and prosperity to help others, but from a global set of interests, again, it helps promote security and stability in areas of the world where economic problems and development are issues that cause instability and require states like the United States, like South Korea, like the United Nations to have to intervene to try to bring stability. South Korea is helping contribute to those efforts as well. And so perhaps as one specific policy recommendation, I know South Korea has talked about increasing its development assistance. While it has made great strides in that, in comparison to other members of the OECD, that unique club of advanced industrial countries, that South Korea on a as a percentage of GDP is relatively low among those countries. If it could increase that to contribute even further. I think South Korea's contributions to UN peacekeeping are another area that are to be congratulated. That in those ways that South Korea could increase those sorts of contributions, hosting the nuclear summit, the G20, those kinds of things where South Korea is a major leader that helps support interests that are important to the United States. I think those are things that continue to show how the alliance is valuable and important for both countries and how they are able to move the global agenda forward. Now again, certainly I would recognize that there will be times when our interests will not coincide. And we may disagree. And we may disagree strongly. But I think that the basis for that the alliance to continue, there are a sufficient and a large number of important common interests that will guide us through the times when we disagree. Our allies in other parts of the world, we don't always disagree. But we have common interests. We have a common base in a democratic system and a common economic system. And those things make it important for all states with those common values to be able to work together and to share. My other vision for the future that I think is important, again, that I come back to, is to continue to talk about our North Korea policy and how we are on the same page with that. Again, if you look historically at the times when we have had difficulty in the alliance, it is when we have had times when perhaps the United States has gone and done things without much collaboration with South Korea, or vice versa, but probably more from the United States perspective. My vision of the future alliance is that we continue the discussion and collaboration that we have now. Again, not that we may not disagree on some of those issues. Certainly we will not always agree on what the best way is to deal with South Korea or with North Korea. And certainly, of course, as both the United States and South Korea are democracies, the challenges will come when we have administrations that are on different sides of the political spectrum, and perhaps have some disagreements along those venues. And you know, we will have to continue to work through those, and those could be some difficult years when we have administrations that may not see things eye to eye, but you know, we continue to talk about those, and even when we have some of those disagreements, that the groundwork is laid for the alliance to continue to work through those problems. Now to policy, and what do we do about the nuclear program? And I think that is the really difficult issue, because I think there are four key parameters in deciding what future policy is. One, I think it is unlikely North Korea will give up its nuclear program. Maybe 10, 20 years ago that was possible. I don't think that's possible anymore. North Korea is committed to developing its nuclear program. I think there will be more tests, ballistic missile, nuclear weapons, not because they're necessarily trying to send messages to anybody, but because if you want an operational program, you have to test things to make sure they work, and I think that's North Korea's direction. I think, though, as well, no one is willing to accept North Korea as a nuclear state. I think North Korea would love to see something like Pakistan or India happen where they tested, everyone gets mad, sanctions are in place, but after 10, 15 years, everyone gets over it. And you start to sort of deal with them normally, quote unquote. I don't think anyone is willing to accept North Korea as a nuclear state, at least for a number of years now, for a variety of reasons, in particular the impact on the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the message it sends to Iran, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that's, so you have two very irreconcilable positions there. The other two key pieces, I think no one is interested in conducting any sort of military action to take out the nuclear weapons. There is no state similar to the Iran situation like Israel that has been threatening and might very likely conduct military strikes to take out North Korea's nuclear weapons capability. And lastly, while I think China has been increasingly frustrated with North Korea's actions, I think in the end there are limits to what China is willing to do to put pressure on North Korea to denuclearize. And so you put that all together and you say, where is the future policy to go given those parameters? I don't have a simple solution to this, but I think at some point, I think absolutely the United States, South Korea, the international community has to insist on the goal of denuclearization and work towards that. But also recognize that it's going to be very difficult to get to that policy, and working with the reality that North Korea may end up never giving up its nuclear weapons. And that at some point, I don't think you can do it now because tensions are just too high, despite, again, the fact that Park Geun-hye has tried. I think at some point you may need to try some sort of an engagement strategy that you continue to try to make some effort to engage North Korea. Not because I think it is a policy of appeasement where you give North Korea all sorts of incentives, but that you at least try to establish some sort of dialogue that may have to de-link the nuclear issue to be able to address North Korea on some other issues. Human rights, perhaps, excuse me, trying to have some level of capping the North Korean nuclear program, or at least as an interim step. Some sort of moratorium perhaps on testing of missiles and nuclear weapons. And I'm not optimistic that any of these things are going to work anytime soon. I'm really talking about a timeline that could be measured in years, 3, 4, 5 years down the road. But that may be something from a policy direction that we have to move forward. And I'm not, again, at all optimistic that any of this is necessarily going to work. Because I think I remember someone describing the Korean Peninsula security position as the land of lousy options. That there just really aren't very good policy options, and that if we think a policy success is getting everything that the United States and South Korea want, good luck with that. North Korea is not going to give in. And it's not that we need to cave in on our positions. Again, I think oftentimes critics of engagement believe that engaging is somehow going to lead to giving away all sorts of incentives. I'm not arguing for that, and I don't think that's necessarily the answer. But that you have to start with perhaps some sort of, as President Park has argued, some level of engagement to build some level of trust to start. And maybe it's even just cultural exchanges, but something that can perhaps begin that. But again, we are not there at this point, given the tensions that we have had in the past.